I have a collection of things to share with you today. They're from my private collection of things related to radiation and radioactivity, and particularly with people's kind of concept of radiation and radioactivity. And I have some stuff here which is radioactive, and some of it's scary, and some of it's just kind of amazing. But I'm going to start by talking about the first period when people became really intrigued with the ideas of radiation and radioactivity. And when people became aware that radiation was a thing. That happened in the late 1800s. And people knew that uranium ore had this interesting property, and it gave off these rays that were energetic. And it also became clear that there was a component of uranium ore that was significantly more radioactive. And Marie Curie was the one who isolated that, and that is, of course, radium. And it was named for its property of being radioactive. So it was this new element that was discovered. And the interesting thing about it was significantly more active than uranium. Uranium-238, which is the primary component of the uranium that you would find in the soil, has a half-life of about 4.5 billion years. Radium has a half-life of about 1,600 years, so shorter by a factor of 3 million. As a consequence, its activity is 3 million times greater. So radium is incredibly radioactive. When Marie Curie first isolated a small sample of it, she found that it actually glowed in the dark, and it was so radioactive it ionizes the air around it, and so it actually glows. And the story goes that she called her husband Pierre and said, "Turn out the lights. Do you remember when I told you that I should like radium to have a beautiful color?" And what's more beautiful than actually like glowing blue in the dark is kind of an amazing, amazing thing. But people became really fascinated with radium, and they weren't aware that it was dangerous, that if you ingested it, the radium would actually cause health problems because it's chemically similar to calcium and it's taken up by the bones in your body. But until people got there, there was this radium craze, and actually Colorado was part of some of it because there were a lot of uranium mines in western Colorado. And the uranium mines, they were mining uranium so that they could extract the radium from the uranium ore. But let me just show you a couple of things from those days. So this is perhaps my favorite. This is the Radium Dance, and I have this sheet music for it. And apparently, when the people were dancing the Radium Dance, they were wearing little outfits that glowed in the dark, and they were energized by radium is the word, although that's not clear. It could have just been phosphorescent glow-in-the-dark stuff, but people just thought radium is so cool. It's like, let's make a dance in this musical Piff Paff Poof, which I don't suppose I will ever see. But anyway, radium costumes. Here's some radium clippers. These are barber clippers. They're better. And if you look at their information, they imply, but they don't actually come out and say that they've made the steel in their barber clippers really strong by putting radium in it. And radium is radioactive, and radioactivity is awesome. So therefore, these clippers, by association, must be awesome as well. It turns out if you look to see if these clippers are radioactive, they are not. There's no radium. There's no radium in there, and you wouldn't put it in there. It wouldn't do anything for steel. This is fantastic, and this is from the western slope of Colorado, Radium brand creamery butter. And they weren't claiming that the butter had radium in it, but just people thought radium was awesome and cool, so why don't you name your butter after that? Why don't we name our butter after something that is known for being radioactive? Kind of a remarkable thing. There's also radium hand soap. That's going to get your hands nice and clean, and it says removes everything but the skin. But actually, if it had radium in it, it would remove the skin too. It doesn't actually have any radium in it. I've tested all these things. None of these have any radium in it whatsoever, but there's still a lot of soap in this tin if you want to try it and see how good it is at getting your hand clean. Now, worse than this, worse than the things which just played on the name of radium and people's fascination with radium, was health tonics. And there were health tonics that were marketed, that were purported to have radium in it. And if you're feeling run down, we need to recharge you. Let's put something in you that is radioactive because radioactive substances have energy. And the people who sold radium tonics in particular noted that the radium was taken up by your body and it stayed with you and gave you those health-giving properties forever after. So there are a lot of radium tonics out there, and I have a bottle of radium tonic. This is Radium Radia. And it says it's good for sciatica, lumbago, sprains, bruises, cold on the chest, sore throat, swollen joints, neuralgia, maybe even for the coronavirus, but we'll never know because there's not very much left in here, but there is some dissolved, or there is some powder, whatever was in the bottle kind of has stayed here. I have tested this and it is not radioactive. You were lucky if you bought radium tonic from a quack, because if there was someone who was selling you something that didn't have radium in it, that was good. The people who were selling the real stuff that had radium in it killed a lot of the people who took their tonics, which is kind of crazy. But the most disturbing thing that I ever found in my quest for radioactive antiques was this thing right here. And there was this perception that radioactivity was good for you, and people who lived in cities were frequently feeling run down. And the theory was that was because they were drinking water which was filtered and treated, and somehow it was removing something from the water that was keeping people healthy. And since radium was cool and radioactivity was cool, people had this idea that maybe it was the radioactivity in the water that was jazzing up those country folks, unlike their city brethren. And so the company that made these water crocks put uranium ore in the actual pottery that they used to make this with. And this thing is ridiculously radioactive. This thing is like scary levels of radioactivity here. And I found this basically prospecting in an antique store with a Geiger counter. And I was just walking down the aisles with my Geiger counter like so, and heard my Geiger counter go off, and I said, there's something in this bay over here, and I just used my Geiger counter and it was led right to this thing. This crock is called the Revigator, and if you read the label on the front, it said it restores nature's vital health element, radioactivity, to all water. And the instructions that came with it said, fill it up with water. When you wake up in the morning, the water will actually be bubbly. And it turns out what happens is the uranium decays, and it decays in this long chain, and at some point it creates radon gas, and the radon gas comes out and dissolves in the water. So you would have radon gas containing water. And then you were supposed to drink 8 cups of this to restore your health, which is kind of crazy. And there were a lot of testimonials that probably made people feel better. Now, radon gas mostly will come out if you drink it and there's radon gas in it, you'll burp it out and you'll probably be fine. You won't ingest a lot of radiation. So it was probably keeping the people hydrated. But if you kept this on your bedside table, you're being exposed to a fair amount of radiation. So I'm going to go ahead and move this away. Now, shortly after this era, people kind of realized like, maybe radiation is a little bit scary and maybe we shouldn't do these things. But in the aftermath of World War II, when the power of the atom was really conclusively demonstrated in warfare, there was this resurgence of interest in things radioactive. And people were very, very excited that we would transition to the atomic age and we would have inexhaustible sources of energy from nuclear power. And people were really fascinated by this, and some crazy stuff came out of this. And I'll show you a couple from my collection. And here is perhaps my favorite. Right here is a pencil, and the pencil says, "Get atomic energy, eat bunny bread." So it's saying like, eat this particular type of bread, and it's going to energize you just like the uranium ore at the end of the pencil energizes a power plant. And this is an actual sample of uranium ore, it says here. And honest to goodness, it is. There's a little bit of uranium ore here, and it's not wildly radioactive, but it's a bit radioactive. And they would give these things to children. This is, you know, it says it's a gold bond #2 pencil. And these were given as giveaways for all kinds of things to advertise your products by tying them to radiation and nuclear power, which seems kind of crazy. I can't imagine that happening now. And then this one here, this is a phenomenal thing. And this is one where there's actually some sense of science behind it. But the main reason why people sold these was because they're just sort of awesome. So this is a Firestone spark plug with radioactive polonium electrodes. And the theory was that when you have something which emits radiation, and polonium, the particular isotope they use, emits alpha particles, it ionizes the air. And if you have something which is radioactive, it'll ionize the air around it. And the idea was it will just give you a much fatter spark because the air is already ionized, and so the spark will jump more easily and more easily fire up your gasoline. Now, in fact, the half-life of the polonium that's in here is just a bit over 100 days. So the chances are that by the time this thing was created and shipped and on the shelf and then in your car, there was not going to be much polonium left in it. Certainly, right now, there's no polonium left in this. But when they were made, there was a significant amount of polonium in the electrodes. Whether it worked or not is an open question, but it played on people's fascination with things radioactive and radioactivity associated with energy. And so what is going to give your car that extra dose of vim and vigor, of pep, of get up and go? Radioactive electrodes, radioactive electrodes. It's kind of crazy. And it has some other things from this era, but they're mostly associated with. In the engineering building, there was actually a bomb shelter built when the building was built. And then for right now, it's used to house our physics lecture demonstration facility. But before they cleaned out all the old civil defense stuff, I rescued a few things. And those things are a piece I'll bring back in a future edition of these videos and talk about that, because I want it to relate to another story about the end of the world. Over the course of the class, we've done the end of the world in a couple of different ways. I'm going to bring that back around and talk about the pieces from that civil defense era, and that relates to some disturbing elements of my childhood. So I'll come back to that, but I wanted you to see this. All these crazy artifacts from the eras of people's fascination with radium and then later with atomic power. And I thought this would be a perfect way to wrap up our discussion of nuclear physics before we move on and do a little bit of reviewing before we get ready for our test. But let's not talk about that, because that's a word you folks don't want to hear just yet. So for just now, we'll be thinking about radiation, nuclear power, people's crazy fascination with it. And we'll have more to say next time.